Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to the Human Project podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about this thing called psychological safety, which goes under a whole bunch of different names. The way we like to talk about it and think about it as being free and being safe to contribute. How a lot of folks tend to shrink back and not contribute with their full selves in relationships, in work, in conversations even, on a more minute basis. So what we're going to talk about is what is psychological safety? How does that look like from a work context? How does that look like from a personal context? What are some things that we can do as individuals to help unleash that psychological safety within us? So dive in, listen up, and let us know what you think. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Chris.
Wanted to talk about this topic of psychological safety. Yeah. It's been really impactful for me. The best teams that I've worked on, the best organizations I've been a part of, they had this high degree of, there's tons of names for it, whether you call it psychological safety, EQ, emotional intelligence, trust. Yeah. It goes by so many different names. But I wanted to spend some time talking about that and just hearing our thoughts on that for anybody that could find that valuable and help connect dots between things. So what do you think of when you think of psychological safety?
Well, and as typical for our approach that we've got here, we can start with what we're used to swimming in, teams and a business context.
Yeah.
But as with all the things that we deal with, it's much broader. It goes deeper than that and ripples through life as well. So let's just explore that, starting with what we're used to in the business context. So for teams that we work with, especially where they need to be creating solutions, have some creativity, innovation, especially for them, without the ability to feel safe to bring up ideas that might be crummy ones, bad ideas, they're not going to be creative, right? And I will say from the perspective of, say, writing content, like we do a lot of content creation or co-writing songs, which I've done a little bit of. And so in my experience, those things are really hard to do unless you feel like you can offer something that is just simply not the best option, but is something that you're thinking about.
Yeah.
Right. This is probably not going to win, but here's something that gets us started, or here's something that starts to express what I'm thinking, and I know it's not perfect, or maybe I do think it's perfect, but I'm afraid it's going to get trampled. But without the ability to enter conversations that way, people are going to filter themselves or show up in ways that simply aren't helping themselves or other people in the environment.
Yeah. So you don't get the best ideas, or you don't get the output of ideas.
Right.
It reminds me, I talk about this sometimes in my classes. Malcolm Gladwell, in one of his books, I think it was Outliers, or talked about a study that was done for some university professor. It was about photography, and he divided the class into two groups. One group he called the output group. The other he called like the perfection group or something like that. And their grades were paced differently. One group was saying you can produce only one picture the entire period of class. So you need to study composition and film and placement of objects and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other group, he said, I don't really care what quality your picture looks like. Your grade is going to be judged solely based on how many pictures you come up with. And so the semester or whatever it was went on. No care for quality. Just number of things. So the semester went on, he continued teaching, and at the end, they showed the final project. And this group over here, the perfection group, produced one image, and it was okay. But he found that not only did this group produce more pictures, but that their pictures were more creative, better quality, and all of the things that you would think of the judgments that would be there for good quality pictures. Because they were able to practice and do it.
Yeah.
And I think psychological safety is very similar. It enables you to be able to share ideas early without fear of a lot of repercussion.
Yeah.
And it's not just psychologically safe or not psychologically safe. There's a big continuum that happens there.
It's not an on-off switch.
Right. Yeah.
So as far as teams are concerned, what are some of the things you've experienced that have enabled you to step into those conversations to offer the 10 pictures that you're like, probably not where we want to be, but they're 10 pictures. Let's try them.
Yeah, there was a good explanation. Pulling things from other places, as I tend to do, inputs. There was a good explanation. I went to a conference one time. The speaker was a guy named Tim Ottinger. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Oh, yeah.
Agile Otter. I think he writes a blog. It was really impactful because he talked and showed this column. And he said, at the top of the column are things that organizations explicitly encourage. And at the bottom of it are things that organizations explicitly discourage or say, that's not permitted here. But the areas of that are so small at both sides of the continuum that there's this big gray area in the middle that folks are like, is this something that I can do, or is this something I shouldn't do? Mm-hmm. And we've all been in organizations where something is not explicitly encouraged or discouraged, and then you try and do something and then you get your hand slapped and said, at least that's how I tend to operate. Yeah. But you get your hand slapped because it's not known. So having things like that, like working agreements, is a big one for teams. That as a smaller individual collective unit, not the large organization as a whole, but what are some things that are the ways that we want to operate? It's been really helpful. Another big one is goals. Like, what's the aim? What's the progress? What's the vision or the story that we're going after?
So why does the story element help you with psychological safety? What's your experience with that?
Yeah, I think the big tie-in with that is it helps us be able to connect as humans. Like, psychologically safe, and we'll dive more into these terms and what they mean or what they could mean. But I think as human beings, we have an innate desire to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And so psychologically safe, or psychological safety, or trust, or belonging might be a good word for this one, particularly in the story.
We pulled out the belonging.
I figured you'd like that word. Helps you be able to connect, like, where's my spot in the story of where our team collectively is going? Like, feel like you're part of something and that you can contribute because you keep in mind the larger goal that you have, not just checking the boxes or taking home a paycheck. Mm-hmm. Like, yes, those things are important. Like, I want to be able to master my job and all of those things. But being able to plug into the story and how do I contribute creatively to that, I think has a big tie-in there.
That's interesting. I was surprised you brought up story as part of psychological safety. I wouldn't have brought that up.
Okay.
I mean, I love story. I love story. But I hadn't connected the two. But I see what you're saying. In a sense, no matter how safe an environment is, there's still some sort of on-ramp. There's still some sort of risk you have to take. And why would you bother doing that if there wasn't some purpose, some transcendent purpose, as Daniel Pink has said famously, that you want to be a part of, that you want to help toward? That's why you're going to take the risk.
Yeah, it's almost like, what's your personal ROI calculation? Because being a psychologically safe environment requires some level of vulnerability. I think we tend to check our emotions at the door when we come into the workplace, or even if we're working from home, whatever it is, we log on to a Zoom meeting, we're like, burp, emotions, leave at door, not welcome here, robot. Yeah, exactly. But with creativity, with us needing to solve problems that haven't been solved before, we need to bring, like, more of our human selves to that and be able to take risks. Yeah. And that risk taking, you only ever take risks if you think the risk that you're taking is worth the potential reward.
Yeah. If it's riskier for you to not engage.
Yeah.
Than it is to engage. If there's more benefit, is another way of saying that. You can look at either side of the coin, but if there's more benefit to you engaging,
yes,
or you feel compelled and drawn into it, then you're going to. The more that I'm so glad you brought this up, because the more that we're talking about this, the more that I'm seeing where the balance comes in. Because a lot of people talk about psychological safety, and it ends up sounding or feeling, or people have the perception of it as this soft, fuzzy thing. We just don't want to get along, right? Yeah. We just all want to be able to be ourselves, however that is, right? And there's an element of everybody be themselves.
Yeah.
And that's not the whole sentence.
It's not just, hey, let's hold hands around the conference room table and
Yes.
light the speakerphone on fire and sing Kumbaya. True story, happened with a team. They didn't actually do it, but that's what their image of psychological safety was when we were talking about it. Yeah.
So it's not just all getting along, and it's not just having no conflict or any of that kind of stuff, right? It's necessary to have conflict. But the part that's really striking me right now about the story element is that's the purpose.
Mm.
We want to be psychologically safe in order to, like, if we put it in user story format,
sure,
that's the reason for psychological safety is in order to something, right?
Yeah.
Whether, and we can take it outside a work environment soon here, but in a work environment for the team to have psychological safety so we can come up with the best solutions, the best results for our customers, for the people who are investing their money and their resources in us producing the product for them.
Yes.
That's why we're doing it, not just because we want to belong.
Yeah.
Now, there's other environments where that could be the reason,
Yeah.
but in a work environment, you need the story, or else it goes off the rails.
Yeah, yeah. It takes it from just being an HR-led initiative of, oh yeah, well our Gallup engagement score was low in this particular thing, so we need to do something about that. No, there's benefit to people, teams, leaders, the organization as a whole, customers, for being able to do that and have that baseline where you can raise that and be able to contribute in a more effective manner. What about you? What have you seen teams be able to do besides goals and working agreements and goals?
Well, I will just rewind a little bit to working agreements. Yeah, working agreements are an interesting thing. Like you said, they're making something explicit that's in that fuzzy middle area that's out of focus for most people. And like you said, you tend to step in and discover where the tripwires are. And other people like myself would tend to just say, well, if there might be tripwires there, I'm never going to step in unless I see someone else step in and they don't get eaten by sharks in that water. So I'm willing to, you know what I mean?
Tripwires, sharks, man, the psychologically safe thing is dangerous.
I'm feeling great already. But to have the explicit conversation, let's talk about some of these things in the middle. And what our intent is about them is really important.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say, like, even that conversation is really hard because it takes psychological safety to have that conversation about what do we as a team or as a group want to talk about and make explicit that we want to do this. So I've experienced that, and I'll be honest, I'm flummoxed by it a little bit because I'm trying to help the team have psychological safety, to feel like it's a safe environment. But some of them can't even have the conversation. Some people can't participate in that. And you can see it, that someone goes like, well, maybe, maybe this would be a good working agreement. All right, let's talk about that. And I see, the 2 or 3 people where clearly they have this like, this is what I think you all want me to say about that. Right. But there's something else back here that's not coming out. And that's that psychological safety wall. It's not safe for them. They don't see it as. I'm like, but the conversation is to try and help that. But even that conversation, right, can't get past that wall.
Yeah, and then you get half answers or false yeses or fake compliance or whatever it is, and then
or silence or any number of things.
Yeah, and then you find that becomes a problem later on. Most of the time, right? The person's either not engaged, they end up leaving, they sow discord. There you go, sowing discord.
That's an app. What are you talking about?
Yeah, Discord. Or they do some other means to subvert what the team is actually doing.
I mean, even in the best of cases, a situation like that ends up completely undermining the psychological safety anyway. Because even if someone, several people on the team just have the walls up, but nobody's trying to be intentionally subversive or undercut. It just works out that what we agree to isn't what we end up doing.
Right.
And so what we talk about is just a facade, and everybody figures it out really fast, even though we don't necessarily recognize it. That let's have another conversation about working agreements. That doesn't matter.
Right.
It's not going to help us. We're just doing this because Mark's asking, or whatever the reason is. Like, oh, we're worse off than before.
I feel the need to inject Scrum trainer hat.
Okay.
Like, I get passionate about this topic, but like retrospectives. It's a big reason why people have, as one of our former colleagues would say, perfunctory retrospectives. As people go in, they show up and they agree to a list of things, but they don't really dive into the heart of the matter because there's no trust, there's no psychological safety, there's no emotional intelligence that's happening there. I think the important thing is and this, I think we can shift gears to the personal side, because the reason it happens is a very personal one.
Yeah, right.
We talked about the risk reward, but then there's also something that happens like neurobiologically with our brains when we feel like we can't contribute.
Yeah, we're checking out. That's where I was going to, is at a point like that with a team, you're not going to, I've not seen anyway, to solve it just by in front of the team going, let's try this again, and this time we mean it. It's not going to change it.
The one that comes to mind for me all the time is, guys, this is a safe environment.
Right. Because I declare it to be
safe. Right. You are now safe. Yeah, that works.
Okay, if you had to say it.
Yeah, right.
It's probably not true.
Right. So any of you, if you ever take a class from me and I say this is a safe environment, please call me out, because that is not helpful.
We're trying to create a safe environment.
Yeah, that's intent.
How could we do that best? That's a different statement entirely than I declare this to be a safe environment because words have come out of my mouth.
It's an invitation in. Even then, it's not just a one-time thing.
Right.
It's an ongoing process of how do we engage people and talk about this. And I think there's a couple elements of how we can do this. One is watch what happens to us from a neurobiological perspective. I think we should spend some time talking about that. The other is like build connections within your team. And then understand, what is that story? What is the goal? What is the reward that you're going after?
Right. So draw with the
start?
story, make the connection so there's some increasing amount of safety and trust individually.
Yeah.
Because what we're talking about when we're talking about teams is a collective, is a community safety in a sense, but that's based on individual safety.
Yes, right.
As well. So if I trust everybody else in the room, but you and I don't trust you, I'm not going to be the one in that room, even with everybody else that I trust, who's going to offer something that seems risky to me.
Right.
So we need start with one.
I just think of all of the studies in psychological is getting hard to say because it's kind of like
easy for you to say.
It's not actually. But I think of all of the sociological, psychological, whatever those surveys are done. There was one I saw a video of that. I'm going to explain this poorly, but trying to think of it on the spot here. I saw a video of this. They did a whole bunch of people, brought them in for like a focus group or something like that. And they pretended to call them in. It was all a setup for this test. And there was this camera of a waiting room. And when a bell dinged, have you seen this one? I have. Okay. Bell dings, everybody stands up. And so everybody there,
there's one person who has not been clued into this in the waiting room.
Yeah, everybody there was a plant except for one person. And the person, like, first couple times just like looked around and was like, what the heck is going on? But over time, as they did this, and it was like every minute and a half or something like that, she would stand up with them. She like begrudgingly did that, and then she did that. And then they slowly started taking people out of the waiting room that were the plants. And then new people would come into the waiting room. I guess they had them on like a schedule or something like that. To the point where there was nobody that was in the waiting room that was one of the plants. It was just, and it wasn't even the original person. And people had gotten so accustomed to the social pressure of people stand up when the bell rings. Mm-hmm. And it was just fascinating to me. So the tie-in with psychological safety.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that. I'm like, where is he going to connect this? Cool.
There's things that are so much cultural to what teams do that people hold themselves back. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of how the tide turns, is changing that culture to be one of inclusion, of all ideas are welcomed, of let's listen and let's build connection, all of these things. And so it takes time to do that, which is always the unpopular answer, but always the real answer.
Humans, am I right?
Yeah.
It's a critical aspect.
I do think something that would be important for our listeners, our viewers, to hear is...
Both of them.
Yeah. That we are hoping will listen to this eventually, is what happens individually. Because I think that's always a good starting spot, is what can we control and look for in ourselves and others.
Yeah.
So there's something that happens when we feel overwhelmed or pressured or not safe that reverts us back to not critical thinking and not leading with creativity.
And not being willing to step in. And it's I'll just connect this to EQ, to emotional intelligence. This is the self-awareness aspect of it. in some regards that we're talking about here. So
Yep.
there's a lot of like lead yourself in order to be able to lead
Yes.
others going on here.
Yes.
But yeah, inside of us, the strongest threat that we could feel of being unsafe, we're going to actually do neurobiological flooding. Is probably where you're going with this, right?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah. So we're actually wired so that when we experience something that's threatening, or we perceive it as threatening, to be more exact in my language, when we perceive something as threatening.
Perceived. So you
Yes.
changed your word, why
I did.
perceived?
Because it doesn't matter if it's actually physically threatening to me or not, my brain is going to treat it. My processing center is going to treat it as if it is actually a threat to me.
Okay.
It doesn't know the difference. It's going to perceive it as a threat. It's going to treat it like a threat. Not going to, so to speak, it's not going to stick around to like analyze it further. It's going to be like, oh, that seems threatening. And so that's the reaction that happens.
Okay.
And the reaction we're talking about is then when your amygdala, the little almond-shaped part of your brain, that is primarily has these emotional memories, we might say. These are oversimplifications because our brains are massively complex. But
sure.
When that amygdala recognizes something as that seems dangerous or reminds me of something that was dangerous in the past, then it says, hey, danger. And the way that the rest of your brain works then is it says, okay, so we're going to treat it like a danger. And that means we're actually going to do some very specific physical things. We get hormones released into our system that end up putting us into something like a fight or flight, freeze, fawn type of response. And the blood to the front of our brain shuts off, our prefrontal cortex, which is where we do what we would call thinking. Okay. So we're going to stop thinking. That's the short answer. We're going to stop thinking at that point. And instead, we're going to do things for me like freeze. So if I'm in a group of people and we're about to get creative and I feel that that is dangerous for me, you're going to see me do nothing. Like I will probably plaster a slight smile on my face somehow without even realizing it and just not really move much except for slight nodding. Right? That's how I'm going to react. And you're not going to get, I'm going to be behind that wall. You're not going to get the ideas and thoughts and reactions that I have behind that wall out of me because I'm trying to protect myself from what I'm perceiving as a threatening environment.
Yeah. It's this self-protection of limiting our creativity or limiting what we're willing to invest because we don't feel safe.
Right.
So that's interesting. So I think I've seen times where you have frozen before.
I think you have, maybe. Once or twice.
My response, and this has actually been really helpful, we have a course that we go through where we talk about these different responses that we have for flooding.
Yeah.
Mine typically tends to be one more of taking charge and making things happen, which can also be equally destructive because I'm not thinking rationally.
Yeah.
And I love the brain science behind it. So that's the cost. Yeah. What's the solution to doing that?
First is awareness.
Yeah. Like awareness, you're flooding, is that what you called it?
If I'm starting to flood, I'm starting to recognize some of the signs, right? My face gets flushed, my shoulders raise, you know, that one. You point that one out to me like, Mark, your shoulders. They're touching your earlobes. So I start to recognize some of my own physical symptoms or people around me that know me well enough can help me. And then what that does is it starts to create this gap between stimulus and response, so to speak, between the thing that I perceive as threatening and what I choose to do about it. I can start to kind of wedge some stuff in there so that I'm able to catch things earlier. I'm starting to flood. I can go, wait, why am I feeling threatened right now?
Yeah.
And then I'm able, because at that point I haven't completely lost all my thinking capabilities, I might be able to get myself back to the spot where I go, that's not actually threatening to me.
Okay.
It's not as threatening as I think it is. Those types of things reframe my perspective. I have opportunities to do that as I'm starting to flood. And so we're just trying to widen the gap.
So watch out for those triggers, like face reddening. Yeah, mine is like my ears, I think, start to get really red. So watch out for those or be aware, like for others too, because it's a social service that you can do knowing that with others too and be like, hey, it looks like, hey, tell me what's going on.
Yeah. Is there some way I can help?
Yeah.
Or even, you can have the best intent and techniques and so on to try and help facilitate a conversation that's creative. But if you're seeing somebody and it seems like they might be flooding, it doesn't matter your intent.
Yeah.
Right. They are less likely to enter into that in a way that's going to help the team creatively. So you can recognize that and even offer to help. Now you might be wrong about what's going on with them, but
just to help make it explicit too, not just within a team setting, because this stuff applies like any relationships. Like I've used this with Victoria, my wife, or like my daughter. I'm like, I've just told you not to do something for the 10th time in a row. And then I'm like, pause. What about the whole like count to 10 thing? Is that an effective technique?
I don't like counting, so it sounds like math to me, so I don't do that. I don't know, does that work for you?
It can be helpful for me to take a pause.
Okay.
Yeah. Like you talk about stimulus, so something happened that I'm flooding about. And I think ownership is the key word. Like you can say something made me flood, or it's really we choose to react to something.
Yeah.
Interesting. So personal, work, tying all this back to psychological safety. So be aware of the individual element of it. When people are, what'd you call it again? Flooding?
Yes.
Flooding.
Neurobiological flooding.
Neurobiological flooding. Neurobiological flooding. Okay. There's that. There's be aware of the story. Be aware of the goal. And then the other ones were like working agreements, right?
Explicitly have the conversations.
Yeah.
That declare the intent, right? Fine, we're trying to create an environment of safety here, and then invite the conversation about how might we go about doing that, so we can be explicit about the things that will help us do that, or it might hurt.
Nice. Yeah. I think that applies for teams, individuals, really any conflict setting. Like we don't have to be afraid of that. And I think it'd probably be good for us to do another video on conflict.
I think it's a horrible idea.
I think it's a great idea. But yeah, if that sounds interesting to any of you that are listening or watching this, we do have a class that we've called Transforming Conflict for now. That's our operating title. We'll see if that sticks. We like to change things around. But yeah, we talk about distress response modes. We talk about how to build connection. That was the last one. That was connection. I knew I was missing something. That's the most important one.
It is.
And talk about how do we do this effectively, individually, and in the team setting. So if that sounds interesting, reach out to us. We'd love to talk about that and get you plugged in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good talking.
Yeah.
Thanks again for tuning in to today's episode of the Human Project Podcast. Our team is made up of myself, Chris Conlin, Mark Wavle, and our lead editor, Derek Donley. We're a crowd-funded nonprofit. Most of what we do is free because of your generous support. If you want to learn more, check us out at humanproject.us. Thanks for partnering with us. Looking forward to talking in the next episode.